Welcome to the Future of the Fork. I'm your host, Guillaume Bouchard. Today, I'm joined with Kai Stoudemire-Williams, founder of HyperFarm. Kai's journey is one of those stories that reminds us how unexpected the path to building a business can be. What started as a personal challenge eventually led her into agriculture, entrepreneurship, community impact, and a completely different future than the one she originally imagined. In our conversation, we explore the experiences that shaped her journey, the lessons she's learned along the way, and why some of the most meaningful businesses are built by solving problems close to home. Kai, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me, Guillaume. I'm really excited about being here today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show as well. We had a conversation last week, and I think you have a really fun story to tell. So let's take a step back before HyperFarm became a company. Tell us about yourself and what brought you to founding this company?
Yes. So I moved my family, I was born in Los Angeles. My family from there moved to Alabama. I was a little girl, probably in about the first grade. Lived in Prattville, Alabama, very rural, southern U.S. countryside in the state of Alabama. And we lived there for about 3 or 4 years. When we moved there, my grandfather at the time had a farm, a working farm. He had cattle. He had a lot of different cash crops. So it was definitely a culture shock moving from Los Angeles to rural Alabama. And it was fun, though. I really enjoyed that atmosphere and being surrounded, everybody on this red dirt road, which still exists today. I was just there this past weekend visiting family. Everybody from the top of the road all the way to the end of the road is family. So you're surrounded by family. And it was just a really loving and nurturing environment as a child. So fast forward, we moved out of Alabama to Ohio and finished elementary school, high school. I go to college in Cincinnati, Ohio. And living in Cincinnati, Ohio is where I met my husband. His name is Robert. And fast forward, we had our first child. And so I went to the grocery store and I was buying baby food, all of my groceries, got home, ready to feed my son. And I noticed that the food had spoiled. It'd been sitting on the shelves for God knows how long. And so the food spoiled. And so I called my mother and I was like, hey, the food is spoiled. He's hungry. I don't know, what to do. I don't have time to go back to the grocery store. And so she asked if I had any fresh fruit, any vegetables. I told her yes. She asked if I had a blender. I did. And so she basically shared how I should just make the baby food at home. And so I did that. And it gave me much more peace of mind knowing that I was able to make his baby food and that I knew it wouldn't be spoiled. And so I continued to do that. And I started sharing how I was making his baby food with different colleagues and friends. And then I was already in the entrepreneurial space. And so I decided, okay, well, let's look at a natural baby food company because there was definitely a need from the families that I was talking to. And at the time, there was a lot of stories in the news about baby food having a lot of metals in it here in the U.S. due to the soil not being regenerated, and larger farmers weren't allowing the soil enough time. So they kept utilizing the soil. And so it was depleting the soil. And that caused there to be more metals found in the baby food from the fruits and vegetables grown in that soil. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe if I can make the baby food for these families, that would kind of give them peace of mind, just like it did for me. And then the overhead started coming into mind. And I said, okay, I'm going to the store, I'm buying all of this fruit and all of these vegetables, and I needed to make the numbers work and the margins without, really sacrificing quality. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I can grow the fruit and vegetables. And so there was a church that I had driven past for 2 or 3 years. And this one particular day, I noticed they had a community garden that was overgrown, that hadn't been used. And so I went over to the church and I spoke to them and asked if I could use it. They said yes. And so we reached out to a colleague. His name is Dominique Peoples. He leads Brick Gardens. And I reached out to him. And so we started working together to grow the food in this community garden. And so we started doing market research with our families and offering the baby food to those specific families. As we were firming up our business plan, renting out commercial kitchen space, really just putting all of the pieces in place to launch this baby food company. And so this is 2020. And so I said, okay, spring of, 2020, I'm going to be ready to hit the ground. I have my market research, my commercial kitchen space. All of the pieces were falling into place and COVID happened. And so I had to make a really challenging decision whether or not I wanted to move forward with the baby food company. It was called Naturally Homegrown, or if I wanted to go back to the drawing board and pivot, because I had family asking us, hey, we don't really need the baby food, but we would love to have the fresh produce. At the time, there was a food shortage as well here in the US due to COVID-19. And so that was a really tough decision because I wasn't growing the food for consumption in large quantities. It was mainly to supplement what I was already doing for Naturally Homegrown. So I really had to take some time and pray about it and go back to the drawing board and decide whether I wanted to make that shift or if I wanted to continue moving forward with Naturally Homegrown. And we lived in a food desert at that time as well. So my husband and I and our family, we would have to drive through 3 or 4 different neighborhoods before we got to a grocery store, before we reached a farmer's market. There were no areas that offered fresh produce within 3 or 4 neighborhoods. And there were lots of people in our community who did not have access to transportation. And so we knew that that was a barrier and a problem. So we decided to pivot. My husband and I discussed it with him and shift and grow in order to supply the demand as far as fresh produce. So that's essentially how we got to HyperFarm. We continued to grow in that community garden, which was about half an acre. And then the demand continued to grow. And we were able to grow in another community garden that belonged to a different church. And so that allowed us to continue to grow. And we were able to source our produce from other female farmers. We were able to rescue produce from other growers who had surplus. And so that allowed us to supplement what we were doing in the garden space that we had. We also partnered with DoorDash. They had a really wonderful community grant that they offered, and it allowed us to supply families with produce, fresh produce every week. They received about 20 to 25 pounds of fresh produce weekly, and DoorDash would pick it up from us and deliver it to those families at no cost. And so that's when we really started shifting, and it was still naturally homegrown. And I had to go back and say, okay, does the mission still work? Does the name still work? And so that's when rebranding started to happen. And I reached out to a colleague looking for a shift as far as the name rebranding, which is where HyperFarm came. And I wanted something that was really like fun and new and spoke to agriculture in a different way that piqued people's interest. And so that's essentially how we landed at what we do today with HyperFarm.
So that's very cool. You started from not having the business, having a challenge with baby food for your own child, seeing that there is a need in the market. But then you're finding that babies' mouths aren't the only ones to be fed. And COVID-19 obviously brought some challenges, especially within communities. I love the story of you taking over community gardens and helping them flourish, sort of say, instead of having them just overgrown and not managed. Somebody's got to do the work. It creates a community, a connection. And now you're building a business out of it. Then you moved into the vertical farming world. Tell us a little bit about how that came about. Why go from community gardens to an enclosed system?
Yes. So in Ohio, the weather is very unpredictable, and it gets warm really late in Ohio, and it gets cold really early in the year. So our growing season isn't as long. And so while we were in Ohio, I started noticing that was an issue as far as production. And so I was trying to figure out how to extend my growing season. Also, the challenges of growing outside, the unpredictability as far as the weather, as far as water, pests, different things of that nature. And so I started to research what growing indoors in some capacity would look like, whether it be a greenhouse, a hoop house. And so I really just started researching from there. And I ran across, again, Dominique and I, we discussed hoop houses and And I said, I need something that is very reliable and that I can kind of control and manage. And so I was doing some research and ran across container farming. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really interesting. And again, when I think about agriculture, because like I said, I grew up on a farm for about 3 or 4 years, I understand how laborious that work is. And it was important for me to offer an opportunity for people to look at agriculture in a different lens and to be interested in agriculture. And so I was very intrigued about growing indoors and how that could bring that same community feeling from a community garden into a space that people would enjoy being in and learn in, because education in agriculture is very important to me as well. So that's really where growing in the container came to be during research. And I found it's manufactured by an organization called HyperFarm. And so that vertical farming system, it worked. It was a small footprint, which worked as far as sustainability. It was controlled. I can control everything from an app from my cell phone. And it was turnkey in a sense to where if you had no experience in agriculture at all, the learning curve was one that you could really kind of get to know in a sense where it didn't take years and years of studying. So it fit into different buckets and checked. It was items that were checked off that I really needed in order to supplement what we were doing in that growing season in that location in Ohio.
Now, I'm sure it brought another challenge because you came from community gardens and now a container, there's costs involved. So
Yes.
how did you fund the project?
So the cost and the learning curve, those are two huge challenges. I went and saw one of the farms. There was one in Indianapolis, which is about an hour and a half away from where I lived at the time. And so I drove, and the farmer's name was Mario, and he graciously allowed me to visit his farm. And as soon as I stepped in the farm, I had that sense like, I know I can do this. And it was similar to buying a new house. When you walk into the house, you know it's yours. It was that same feeling. And so we started talking, and he shared information about his overhead, about cost. And I reached out to the company at the time. I was in communication with them as well. And this is still during the COVID timeframe. And so thankfully, there were a lot of grants that were available that had not been available before, supporting community agriculture and sustainability. And so it was just such a blessing that those grants lined up with the time frame that I was raising money, and I was able to raise the funds for that farm within that year in order to have the farm prepared and ready for delivery the following year.
All right, so the financial piece was figured out. What about the differences in growing in a controlled environment versus growing outdoors? What are the crops that you've been testing and found success, or maybe decided maybe not to grow in again in that container?
Yes. So ideally, what I would like to do is grow outside and indoors, to have the best of both worlds, of course. And that was the plan in Ohio. But my family actually moved from Ohio to South Carolina. So when we transitioned to South Carolina, I had to leave the farm in Ohio for 2 years. And so it was like leaving a child almost. And that was very challenging. And so when I got to South Carolina, I had to figure out the agricultural space here. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any connections. I wasn't plugged into the community. And so I really had to immerse myself into the agriculture space here in South Carolina to understand what that looked like, what crops grew best here, what zone South Carolina is, pests, the flow of the weather, all of these things I had to relearn. And so since I was growing inside, that helped to kind of frame the weather piece. I didn't really have to worry about that as much as it relates to what types of crops I was growing. And then I have a much smaller space. So when I was growing outside, I loved growing watermelon, cantaloupe, all of these really huge items, the root vegetables, corn, sweet potatoes, all of those really heavy vegetables and fruits. I loved growing those. But when you switch into growing indoors, your space is limited. So that definitely has an impact on what you can grow. So now I'm not able to grow watermelon inside the farm or the cantaloupe or corn, different things like that, but I can still grow all of my leafy greens, Swiss chard, spinach, varieties of lettuce, any type of herb. I can grow smaller root vegetables like radishes, smaller carrots, turnips, different things like that. Edible flowers, which I love, they're really pretty. And being able to grow flowers indoors, it's very pretty because everything is really closed in. And so still having that kind of nature inside is really beautiful. I can still do cherry tomatoes and a variety of things like that. So we still have a variety. We're just not able to grow the larger fruits and vegetables because of the limited space.
So tell us where you are today. You had the container back in Idaho. Now you're in South Carolina. What does success look like for HyperFarm today? Where are you today and what are the next steps?
Yeah, so like I said, the journey has been a very long one. We are just now in a position to where we're starting to become operational. When we moved from Ohio to South Carolina, there were so many different barriers as far as zoning. We had a Hurricane Helene hit South Carolina and Greenwood specifically where we live in a way that it has never hit before. So there are so many different challenges that we've had to overcome. And the farm was delivered here in 2024. And so we're just now becoming like up and running and operational. And so right now we are focused on getting contracts for local restaurants, making sure that the local schools know who we are. Like I said, agriculture and education is really important for us. We would like to have students come into our space and be able to learn in our space and still open the farm up, have community days so that families can come in. We want people to know where we are. We're really proud that we have been approved to accept SNAP EBT. So people who receive funding from the government to purchase food, we're able to accommodate those families as well to ensure that everybody has access to fresh local produce. And farmers markets, going to market, that's something that we're looking forward to. So really scaling at this point and becoming self-sustainable is something that we are looking forward to as a newer business.
And so for our listeners listening, what's the best way to get in touch with you? Maybe you're looking for funding, maybe you're looking for partners or restaurants to work with. What's the best way to connect with you, Kai?
We have a website. It's www.hyperfarm.co. We're also on Instagram at HyperFarm_, and we're also on Facebook at HyperFarm SC, the letter S and the letter C. And they can always email. My email is listed on our website and our Instagram as well.
Kai, thank you so much for joining us today. I love these stories. What stood out for me was you start with baby food and you're no longer in the baby food business. You're in the vertical farm business and trying to feed communities and also supporting, the supply chain of restaurants, for example. And it's got to start from somewhere. And I'm really looking forward to see how you scale this business in the next few years and wish you all the luck.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I found really interesting with this is, as I mentioned, growing up in Alabama, I knew that my grandfather was a farmer. But one of the things that I've learned during this journey is that you just don't know where entrepreneurship will take you, not only as far as the business, but personally. And so being in this line of work has helped me to learn more about my family, even more so as far as our heritage and lineage, and learning that I come from 4 generations of farmers and all of the different crops and things. And so when I was growing food outside, and even now, just better understanding, some of it is innate. It's because it's been done. It's for generations and generations. So that's something that I am enjoying about entrepreneurship. You just don't know where it's going to lead you and how much you're going to learn on that.
Absolutely. It's crucial to take a first step and start moving, and you'll get to your journey. It's hard to pre-plan where you're going to end up. But if you get started, the path will get clearer and clearer.
That's right.
To our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with some peers. This was The Future of the Fork, and see you next time.